Good evening, good afternoon, good early evening. Welcome once again to the Coral Gables Public Library. We are part of the Miami-Dade County Library System. My name is Alex. I am one of the staff here, library staff. I am the person who coordinates these type of events. And so I know that some of you know me, and of course the association, Dr. Justiniani and Mr. Sayas Hassan, I deal with them, Dr. Rosali, on a regular basis. But nevertheless, I want to welcome you once again to this very special program that we're having. Before I ask Dr. Rosali to come up, I want to ask a big favor of you, the audience. As you exit here on the right-hand side, there is a table. You will find these sheets. They are the program evaluation. And I'm going to ask you to do it's very fast, 3 minutes, and mostly just check. And I'm going to ask you to take 3-4 minutes to fill this out before you leave. It is the way for us, the library here at Coral Gables, to learn from you, about your interests, what you thought of the program, what you liked, what you didn't like. And so we use these to base our future programming, and so of course we always try to bring the very best of programs to the library. So I would like to ask Dr. Orlando Rosali, President of the National Association of Cuban-American Educators, to please take over the floor.
I'm going to try this one. It's working? Yeah, it's working. Well, thank you very much. Welcome for everybody here. We usually conduct this in Spanish, but today is going to be different. And we are proud to have a conference. Oh, it's not? Okay. We are proud to have a fantastic person going to talk to us today, but the presenter is going to be Dr. Justiniani. I just want to let you know that the National Association of Cuban-American Educators, that was established in 1990, is a nonprofit organization with a big mission. A mission that is representing in the United States and Puerto Rico the interests of Cuban-American educators on all levels. Also publicizing their academic achievement in order to achieve and the mission is to communicate periodically with its member by electronic mail, etc., and certain publication. NACA organized also a monthly circle of education program, conferences, exhibition, concerts, etc., with the objective of highlighting and preserving our historical roots and promoting the ethic, artistic, and cultural value of Cuban and Cuban-Americans. Also, NACAI grant every year the prestigious award of Educator of the Year to a Cuban-American educator who had been made important contribution to his or her field of expertise. We have many people already at this time that got that prize: Mr. Felipe Pasos, Mesa Lago, Levi Marrero, Luis Aguilar León, Manuel Villamonte, Nicolás Quintana, Gustavo Pérez Firmat, etc., a number of people that already obtained this award. Also, NACAI grants annually a scholarship in honor of Dr. Gaston Fernandez de la Torriente. Is a tribute to our past president and longtime executive director. The scholarship is given to a Cuban and Cuban-American student selected in a contest competition. Again, thank you for being here, and I'm going to pass the microphone to Dr. Justiniani, who's going to introduce our conference of the day. Thank you.
It's really, for me, a privilege to welcome our speaker today, on behalf of the Nakai. My dear colleague, an illustrious and brilliant colleague, Dr. Charles Santos-Buch. Dr. Santos-Buch, as you all know, has written a book that is in the process of being published. Can you hear me? The name is A Different View of Cuba's History, and the subtitle is very appropriate. It reads, Revealed by an American Family, Journey through the 16... I had to use my glasses, I'm sorry. I'm trying to guess the words instead of reading. Revealed by an American family's journey from 16th century Cuban colonialism to modernity, the years of 1509 to 1960. Dr. Santos-Buch is a member of one of the oldest families of the New World that established its roots in the eastern lands of Cuba in the first decade of the 16th century. He's a graduate of Harvard College and the Cornell University Medical College, and he's a retired Cornell Associate Dean of Students and Professor of Pathology. He's the author of numerous scientific publications in important international journals on subjects like hemorrhagic strokes, Chagas disease, arterial diseases, and other infectious agents. As you will see when he takes the podium, he's a great storyteller. So the book, I can tell you, that is also very entertaining. I was given the privilege by him to let me review the different chapters when he was in the process of writing them. And I can tell you that it's a very entertaining and also very, it teaches you a lot about the history of Cuba and the approach of using his family history to, as a, let's call it a pretexto, or as a way of developing the history of Cuba is also a very, very unique approach. His prose traces his family journey from its rise in Islamic Spain to Cuba's modernity. His insightful story covers in a different way the major historical events of the tragic island that impacted his family's journey. He uses in this book his family history as paradigm of the effect of erratic political and economic policy spanned centuries. The format of this presentation is also very unique. He has decided that he is going to be interviewed by his son, Charles Santos-Buch Jr. Charles Jr. is a very successful businessman, a graduate also of Harvard College and of the Wharton School of Business, and he has an extensive knowledge of the Cuban Revolution for the fact that when he was graduating from Harvard, his thesis was, the title was The Cuban Revolution, the Role of the Middle Class in Oriente Province, 1956-1959. This thesis was approved or published in March 20, 1980. He has a very good knowledge of the revolution because he based his thesis in tape interviews of many principles of the Cuban Revolution. So I think that we are in for a very interesting treat, and please help me welcome the two Charlies.
Thank you, Federico. Appreciate all the comments of my father and myself. Welcome, everybody, to this event. Very proud to be here. Thank you to the association for inviting us as well. The scope, as Federico pointed out, we're really trying to cover 500 years of history in whatever time we have. which is a lot of work. I think the book, when it comes out and you read it, is challenging to traditional Cuban thought, which is interesting. I think that in itself provokes at least interest from many people that know Cuba and know the tragedies of the country. I think the unique thing about this presentation and the book itself, I'm very proud of my father, is it does take our family legacy of the de Céspedes family through its trials and tribulations, some successes, some failures, through many, many centuries to where we are today, and we're descendants of the family. But I would say that I think the principal thesis, as I've read his book and understood more and more, if I got deeper into this whole analysis and study, is that the de Céspedes family really acted as antagonists for many, many centuries. In Spain against the Moors, and when they migrated, immigrated to Cuba against the Spanish regime, and then later against Batista, and then even later against Castro, and here we are today. So I think our family has been very notable in the insurrections for all those revolutions throughout that history and time. And as I said, really for the greater good and the greater cause of independence, of Cuban independence. And you'll see that theme resonate throughout the talk. As Federico said, we thought that the format today would be, at least from the beginning, have a question and answer where I've framed the book as much as I could into questions to my father that provide structure for the audience. Because I think if we just go chapter by chapter, we're going to get lost in terms of the details. There's so much content, there's so much information here that it's a lot. So I'm going to take, from a chronological standpoint, chronological order from the beginning of the book in general, and break it down into events that, from my perspective and talking to my father, were very important in shaping Cuban history and in its time, and take you to where it is today, before it will end up in the Bay of Pigs, before we get into modern day Cuba, but that'll end at that point in time. So with that, Pop, why don't you come up, and I have to run the projector, that I will push the buttons from there, and I'll ask the questions from.
Thank you so much, Federico, for your very grateful for this introduction. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Closer to the mic. All right. So this is going to be more like a workshop between the audience, myself, and my son. He's going to ask me questions, and I'm going to try to frame the answers. But we want the participation of the audience as we go along. You will have a Q&A session after the first 40 minutes, but let's make this as a conversation. All of us here are Cuban intellectuals, and we are very well acquainted with the history. The approach here will be different, as you'll see.
All right, Pop, we'll start it off here. Question number one: when did the Céspedes migration begin to Cuba, and why did they leave Spain, given their alleged status at the time where they were pretty noble? And why did they settle in the Oriente province? And I'll preface that we have a map, which when you answer the question from Spain, the migration to Cuba, and you can refer to in relation to Havana, Oriente province, et cetera.
Yes, of course. The Céspedes were knighted by following military victories against the Moors in La Reconquista. They were very successful. They gained more fame and property when they conquered Seville, which was the capital of the Muslim kingdom of Seville. And they were given properties that still exist there. There's a segment there called the Carrión de Céspedes in Osuna. When Columbus discovered America, they were recruited by the king to administer an encomienda, a land grant, in the Gulf of Guacanayabo, which is here. So you see the little map of Cuba, that little rectangle in the upper left-hand corner.
is where the encomienda was done. The encomienda was huge, over 175,000 acres. It was about a quarter the size of Rhode Island, the smallest state of the Union. The important thing about this map is the distance between the Golfo de Guacanayabo and Encomienda and the site of political power and military power in Havana. What happened then was that the members of the encomienda had to make decisions by themselves. They could not, to have edicts transferred by goletas or sailboat all the way from Havana to this part of the Oriente Province took more than a month. So the adventurers that administer this encomienda, they form a form of autonomy. And this has become, this is very important to understand as we go along.
Thank you. We're going to move a little quickly up through time. So we're going to get to the 19th century pretty quickly here in a very famous event called the 10 Years' War, started in 1865. And the Cespedes family had a big role in that. So maybe you can address that evolution of the family, and it's bringing you quickly to that position, because there was years that they were prospering, I would imagine, right?
Yeah, you might show the next figure,
Slide,
because
yeah. Right.
This is Major General Carlos Manuel de Cespedes del Castillo. He was the oldest of 7 children of the Cespedes family, and he had he had the best education. He was the richest of all of them. He spoke different languages. He was educated in Spain, traveled through Germany, France, and briefly, this travel resulted in that he became a liberal, in the sense that he liked the form of government of every republic. And he conspired in a small period of time in General Grimm's revolution that failed to depose the monarchy in Spain. He returned to his homes in San Salvador de Bayamo, and his land properties, which were extensive, included La de Majagua, and in Contramaestre, another huge farm. He was incredibly rich. He defended pro bono a early insurrectionist against Spanish rule in Oriente, and failed, and the plaintiff was executed, and his youngest brother, Pedro de Cespedes, the youngest brother, who's my great-grandfather, was his conspirator, colleague in this process. The Spanish authorities took notice of their rebellious nature, and trump-up charges were made. They were arrested, and they were condemned 2 years in an old Trafalgar wooden boat in the Bay of Santiago in chains. They were a family were able to reassure the Spanish authorities that they were not dangerous to Spain, and so they were transferred from the boat to the house arrest. But nevertheless, they were transferred from one jail to another. These events, instead of discouraging them from their thoughts of liberating Cuba, they became even hardened patriots against Spain. So with their friends in Oriente, the rich landowners principally, they conceived the idea of an armed rebellion in Cuba, with the idea of, and this is very important, the idea of establishing a republic like the American Republic here. That led to conspiracies, money from the landed rich, and then they organized a small militia that didn't know much about military things, and then they met in the first Guaymaro assembly in Camagüey, and this gentleman, as you see, with a gold tip stick, was named president of the Republic in Arms. He was elected to this position after a public proclamation. This is really the Cuban version of a Declaration of Independence in the Majagua plantation of Carlos Manuel. It was a great oration, and there they proclaimed freedom for all African slaves in Cuba. A lot of the slaves then joined the militia, and they started to plan military operations, principally in Oriente province, in this area.
So taking that from that period there and the evolution of this attempt to freedom of Spain, there were a couple of events that happened within the 10 Years' War that ended up not working out for this group. Well, one of the most important ones was the Virginius affair. Maybe you can touch on that and the significance of the Virginius affair.
Yeah, the 10 Years' War was a calamitous 10 years. They really didn't know how to conduct military operations, and they had failures and some triumphs. My great-grandfather, Pedro de Céspedes, came to the United States, to New York, and with other three generals, they and a crew of troopers aboarded a ship bought by La Junta Revolucionaria of New York called the Virginius. The Virginius was used in the, you can show the next two, I guess.
Yeah, I guess I'm sleeping at the switch here.
The Virginius was that's my great-grandfather.
That's Pedro, yeah.
Pedro Céspedes. This is heirlooms from our family heirlooms. This is the only photo of Pedro Céspedes in existence. The other thing, so the Virginians had made at least 3 trips transporting arms, ammunition, and men to the insurrection in the 10 Years' War. But in this, the largest and most expensive expedition was in November of 1873, and they used Jamaica as a port to load the arms and munitions and men. And the Spanish authorities were notified that the Virginians was in Kingston, and they sent a frigate called Toronado, which was bigger and with cannons, well armed, and is in pursuit. You can see the left-hand corner, the Toronado caught up with the Virginians. The Virginians could not go fast enough. They had to dump all the arms, the rifles, all the ammunition to the sea, and it was captured by the Toronado. There was no evidence of, at high seas, it was intercepted at high seas, no evidence of armaments or anything, and it was contrary to the law of the sea to intercept a ship which was flying the American flag and was registered in New York. The Virginians was taken to Santiago de Cuba, and they were the crew and the 4 generals in the ship, including my great-grandfather, were executed. It was more than 85 members were killed. The massacre was stopped by the intervention of Great Britain frigate Niobe, which here is the Captain Fry of the Virginians saying goodbye.
I think that's Pedro, too.
And so they were executed by firing squad. They are buried in a mass grave in Santa Ifigenia Cemetery. So Sir Lambton Lorraine came into Santiago Bay and demanded to talk to the governor, Gurriel. The meeting is very interesting because Don Tomas Beatty, of the Beatty families we all know here, was he translated what was said English to Spanish. Beatty is a Scot, from Scot parents, and he was born in Santiago de Cuba. He loved Santiago de Cuba, spoke Spanish perfectly. And so this was a very intense meeting because Lambton Lorraine said that if you don't stop the massacre, I will reduce Santiago de Cuba to rubble. It was a very loud discussion. They postponed the meeting for 2 days, and by the following day, an American frigate, the Wisconsin, and probably you don't know this because it's not in our history books, but it is in the Annapolis records. The USS Wisconsin came into Santiago Bay and demanded Spanish authority to release the Virginians and to stop the massacre and return them to New York. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. Reparations were really were also demanded, but by that time, it was shown that the Virginia was a ship owned by the Junta Revolucionaria, so there were no reparations. So what happened with the Virginians, the importance of Virginians is that after that, more significant tragedies beset the 10 Years' War. Ignacio Agramonte was killed in the Battle of Himawayu. Agramonte was probably the most intellectual and prominent military of the 10 Years' War. His thesis in the University of Havana was arguing against Karl Marx's communist ideas. And he was a very strong counter-communist orator. And he did not get along with President de Cespedes much, but they both collaborated during the 10 Years' Wars. The problem with that loss is that when Jose Marti comes into view, is that Jose Marti has liberal ideas. He was really a left or center thinker. With the loss of Agramonte, there was no counterweight in the direction that the revolution against Spain was going to go. So it was a real tragic loss, Agramonte. The next thing is that Carlos Manuel's son, also called Carlos Manuel, de Céspedes y de Céspedes. And the Spanish military asked Carlos Manuel to surrender, and so that his son would live. Carlos Manuel refused, and his son was executed. And the next thing that happened was that our family of Pedro de Céspedes, all the women and the children were rounded up by the Spanish military authorities, put on a British freight, and exiled permanently. The British captain took him and released them in Kingston, Jamaica. My grandmother, my immediate grandmother, was born in Kingston, Jamaica. She became, by birthright, a British subject. They confiscated all their property, all their monies, and they were greatly impoverished. They had to set up a little store where they would make dresses to the British Empire women. That was a difficult time. After the Paso de San Juan, my family in Kingston was able to return, but of course they didn't have any properties and not much money. They progressed to improve their lot by marrying well, and that saved that family.
So as the family evolved, they migrated back to Oriente Province.
Oriente Province.
Tried to make a living there, obviously.
La Caridad de Macaca. The communist name was La Caridad de Macaca, and that's where they lived all their life. Caridad de Macaca is very close to Media Luna, and if anybody that has been in that part of Cuba understand the area very well.
Well, during this period, there was a lot going on in Spain internally. So there was a big migration of Peninsulares to Cuba during this period, 1880 to 1895 era. That's important because that created more controversy between the criollos and the colonists, in effect.
What happened was, son, is that Professor Nicolas Quintana spoke brilliantly to this group some years ago about this emigration. What happened was that Spain was going through terrific economic depressions. And Cuba, even though we had the 10 Years' War, was progressing and very well. Havana was becoming one of the most beautiful cities in the New World. So a lot of Spaniards came to Cuba. Professor Quintana showed more than 3 million Spaniards migrated to the island. And I tried to get information what the population of Cuba was in 1853. And there is a French sociologist that went to Cuba, stayed there 5 years, and collected the statistics. As a matter of fact, he calls it statistics. And he described how he obtained that information. And he established that there were only about 2.5 million Spanish. Slaves were not counted in the island in 1853. So this migration of 3 million Spaniards was immense. It changed the culture of the island. It changed the economy. It changed the politics. And it is extremely important. Nicolas Quintana's contribution is really very significant. The Spanish return, immigration, they felt superior to the Cuban criollos and, of course, of the slaves. And so there was a conflict between the criollos and the newcomers, which were better trained, better businessmen, better organizers, and the economy of Cuba, with that immigration, improved greatly. And not only the economy, a lot of intellectuals, Spanish intellectuals, came to Cuba and they improved the university. There was only one university in Havana at that time. So it was a mix that was getting along with difficulty, with great difficulty. After the Peace of the San Juan, the exiled Cubans began to come back, and they were snared by the voluntarios. Voluntario was an extra military group that sycophantic believers in Spain, and they were organized to suppress the Cuban people if they attempted to make trouble. So it was a lot of conflict at that time, yes.
Well, from that period, there were some key characters and agents that came out of this. What you mentioned earlier, Jose Martin being one of them, but also members of the De Cespedes family. So there's an evolution now of counterinsurrection and dissidents that
But now
started to grow.
The Cubans were greatly organized. Contrary to the 10 Years' War, where they were learning artillery placements, military marches, positioning to win battles, now they were ready. Not only were they ready, what is amazing is the number of American officers that came to Cuba to fight with the Cubans against Spain. And so the Civil War was very, very important because all of these officers, which were adventurers but warriors, joined. Maximo Gomez had at least 4 generals, 4 officers, 1 general, majors, colonels in his general staff, Americans.
And you had Maceo, General Maceo and Garcia as well.
Well, the Cubans were, by this time, very well trained. They knew what they were doing. Donato Marmo, Maceo, the 2 brothers, Jose and Antonio, the group in Camagüey, and they were all very well trained. They knew what they were doing. Spain had to send enormous troopers to Cuba. And Pedrito Roy, in his book, The Death of a Dream, you have to buy that book. It's excellent. He describes that at the end of the day, by the War of Independence of 1895, Spain had an army in Cuba that was 252,000 troopers of the line. That was the largest transfer of a foreign army to the Americas ever. It was, despite that, the Mambistas fought toe-to-toe with these European trained, and they did very, very well. Very, very well.
So trying to take this a little further, because there's a lot of material still to cover here. The United States played a big role in the last War of Independence.
Right.
And under President McKinley, for one, he was, very much involved in support. Admiral Mahan of the Navy had.
You might want to put his photo there.
This young lady here was one of the slaves that was part of the.
That was my grandfather's, great-grandfather's slave, Sisa, which also was freed, of course.
Right.
And the child that she's carrying is my uncle, Charles Gregg. She was part of the family. African slaves were not a problem with us, really. And here's a collection of the heroes of the 10 years war and the War of Independence. And the $100 bill is Vicente Aguilera, who was, today he would have been a billionaire, a principal financer for both wars of independence. And of course, you have Máximo Gómez, José Martí, Antonio Maceo, Calixto Garcia. These were the principles of the war against Spain. Move on, say.
It's just a slow computer. It's a
mentally retarded.
No, it'll get there.
Oh no.
Maybe you can talk, Pop, as we keep going here in terms of there's some important battles that happened in the War of Independence that led to the success of it. But
before we go into the American intervention in our war, it is very, very important to be aware of Rear Admiral Alfred Mohan. He just before the turn of the century wrote 2 volumes that were read all over the world. because it described the importance of nations that needed to expand to have a very good fighting navy. And the European imperialists immediately took up his recommendations. It's too bad we can't show him. But his importance is immense. The Spanish War, as the War Department of the United States was called, the Spanish War was not just Cuba. It was a war against an imperialist nation. And so you have the targets of the planners of the Spanish War. The targets were the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, and the small islands, the Mariana Islands and the other in the Pacific. They were not going to attack Spain. They were not going to invade Spain. That was the least of their thoughts. And Moynihan's contribution to the planning was significant. America was just flourishing industrially. They had so much power, and they wanted to create new markets in the Pacific. And that's the importance of the Philippines. And Cuba was dangerous because it was in the underbelly of the United States and threatened the sea lanes from the Gulf of Mexico and the development of Texas to feed the markets of Europe, including oil, of course. So the planners did not have any thought of landing in Spain or attacking any of the ports of Spain. This plan was prepared at least 5 years before 1898, which is when the Spanish War starts. It was beautifully designed. And one of the things of the planners was they knew that they had to have a large enough navy to blockade the targets, strategic targets that in Luzon, the Philippines, and Oriente Province, and Puerto Rico. The Oriente Province target was preferred because the Mambises controlled it as best they could very well. And Santiago de Cuba was selected as the port that they wanted to capture to bring in more troops and then slowly conquer the island. In Luzon, the Philippines, it was the same strategy. This was coordinated with insurrectionists. Messengers were sent to the insurrectionist Cabulos in Luzon to prevent reinforcements on the beaches and allow American troops to land in Luzon. In Oriente Province, the contact general was Calixto Garcia, who received what the plan and how it was going to be done. And between Máximo Gómez and Calixto Garcia, they prevented Spanish troopers to reinforce the targets in Santiago. This was, it worked like clockwork. It worked like clockwork. It was incredible. When Admiral Dewey blockaded Luzon in the Philippines, Admiral Sampson blockaded Santiago de Cuba, and the Spanish fleet was trapped in Santiago. The admiral of the Spanish fleet was very well respected by American planners. Very well respected by American planners. And he was very efficient, a real courageous man who was not going to give up. And so the largest naval battle in the Caribbean Sea was done just at the entrance of Santiago de Cuba. The American battle fleet consisted of 5 battleships built according to the designs and purposes that Admiral Moynihan had recommended, and 1 cruiser. The Spanish fleet consisted of 4 very fast cruisers and 1 destroyer. The American battleships were slower, but they had bigger cannons, and they were very accurate. The Spanish cruisers were much faster, and Cervera thought that the only chance that he could have was to get out of Santiago Bay and try to steam at high velocity and elude the American fleet. It was an incredible battle. The Americans were able to sink and damage all of the Spanish ships as they came out of Santiago one by one. There was a ring of battleships right outside, and it was really, I have beautiful photographs of that. I didn't know how bad this battle was until when I was a youngster. I used to dive and fish underwater, and I jumped in the area where the battleships were sunk, and so I could see with my mask the Spanish ships and how damaged they had been. It was something I'll never forget in my life. That was incredible. I had to get out because there were too many sharks, so I had to jump back into the boat and get back to port. But that was an adventure that really excited me.
We're still working on this, Dad, but maybe you can take from the battle to the success of the war,
Yeah.
and then the whole structure of the regime that came in place and their family role there, and then we'll move it on from there as we have
I'll
more room
get
to
to
cover.
that. The naval prowess of the United States was so important in this war. The troops landed in Siboney and Daiquiri beaches just east of Santiago without any trouble. There was no resistance. Why? Because Máximo Gómez and Calixto Garcia used their cavalry in incredible assaults of the Spanish troop reinforcements. And I wish I can show you the oil paintings and the sketches of what was happening. But let me just say that in the Battle of Desmayo, this is just one example of Máximo Gómez's charge. One charge of 459 cavalry troopers, Cuban cavalry troopers. This battle was observed by an American lieutenant colonel assigned to Máximo Gómez General Staff. More than 53% of the Cubans were killed inside 20 minutes because of the Spaniard superior breech cannons, repeating rifles. It was just better armor. This Battle of El Desmayo in Camagüey is written up in military, by military scholars. And they compare this Desmayo battle to the Battle of Balaclava in the Crimean War, the charge of the Light Brigade, and Tennyson's poem, you know, that made it so famous. Those two battles, the charge of the Light Brigade and the charge of the Cubans at El Desmayo, compared as same type of horrible carnage in a battle of this sort. So it is interesting. It was the Cubans that allowed the Americans to land without any problems. Two generals. Should I continue?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
The two generals, William Lawson and Calixto Garcia, collaborated together to do the most bloody encounter of the attack on Santiago. The northern flank of the San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill, the northern flank was a small garrison called El Viso. And this is just outside El Caney. A Spanish general, Joaquin Vara del Rey, and 500 Spanish troopers, well armed, courageous, enthusiastic, looking for a fight, were guarding the right flank. The Americans could not attack San Juan Hill or Kettle Hill if El Viso and El Caney were reduced. Lawson's troopers, American troopers, and Calixto Garcia's troopers attacked the 500 Spanish soldiers and wiped them out totally, including General Joaquin Vara del Rey. That allowed Ted Roosevelt and the Rough Riders and the other American troopers to do a frontal attack on San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill successfully. That battle of El Caney is compared to General Custer's when the Sioux wiped out the 7th Cavalry totally by the insurrectionists in North Dakota. You can compare the two in that way. I was able to interview one survivor of El Caney, a Spaniard. He was very old, and I asked him questions, it was just an incredible thing. Yeah.
So post those battles and then the success, the country became independent free. There was
But
installation.
not only that, it was successful in the Philippines and in Puerto Rico. It was so well coordinated. That's why Spain surrenders, because the Pacific and the Atlantic were conquered by American military strength.
So talk about military, American military, and their influence in Cuba at this point in time, post the success of the battles in Santiago and Oriente in Cuba, Spain's surrender. What happens to the country now, and what role did our family play in that?
The Americans were very lucky to have a Harvard graduate, General Leonard Wood, a doctor. And he was assigned to pacify Oriente province. The other generals went to Havana. They really did a horrible job in Havana. But Leonard Wood, very smart man, he recruited Cubans in the 4 years of occupation by the American forces, and even some Spaniards, to help bring Oriente back. And of course, none of these successes would have been accomplished if Don Emilio Bacardí Muro was appointed by Leonard Wood as mayor of Santiago, and later he was elected mayor of Santiago. Oriente owes Don Emilio an incredible debt, and so he brought honesty in government. The coffers of government were restored. He paved the city of Santiago. He introduced the running water from 2 dams that were constructed by American engineers. And he used some of the engineers in our family to do that, from the BUCH branch of our family. It was those 2 years of Leonard Wood in Oriente province were just after, we were so good that the other generals in Havana were fired by Washington, and Leonard Wood was appointed the general officer in Havana. And in Havana, he did the same thing. He picked Cuban intellectuals, like you guys, and wrote the Constitution of 1902. The Constitution of 1902, by some Cuban scholars, they believe it's the best constitution that Cuba had been written, but it had 2 major flaws. If you were a Cuban and you did not make $500 a year, you could not vote. That's one. The second restriction was you had to know how to read and write to vote. That created a lot of problems for us Cubans, a lot of problems, because created one of the reasons for the racial wars that developed. The first racial war that developed was in 1905, at the end of the Estrada Palma presidency. The black Afro-Cubans wanted to create a black republic. No whites, absolutely no whites, which of course was anti-constitutional. And it failed. It was suppressed by Estrada Palma. The second racial war was bigger and more dangerous, and that was in 1909, I believe. And that was suppressed by Mario Garcia Menocal when he was a brigadier general. And the suppression was conducted by Mambi officers, Mendieta and Monteagudo, I think. And peace was restored. The last racial war was in 1917, what we call La Chamberona, and that was even bigger, principally in Oriente Province and in Las Villas. It was General Quintín Banderas, an Afro-Cuban, was one of the officers of La Chamberona. He was killed, and that was the biggest casualty because he was a veteran of the Independence War. The Chamberona was suppressed principally by Colonel Arsenio Ortiz, which in Oriente, the Orientales and Santiagueros, when they speak about Ortiz, is a mix of awe and fear. He bragged about how there were not enough trees and posts to hang the rebels. And if you travel in the Oriente Province, you see hundreds of black rebels hanging from their neck in Oriente Province. My father was a doctor practicing in Contramaestre. He was captured by the black insurrects. And he treated the wounds of both sides, as we all do. And finally, the leader of that group said, "Doctor, you have to leave. We're going to exile you to Key West. There is a sailboat sailing to Key West. It's in Contramaestre. And because you're in danger if you stay here." So he was exiled to Key West. He had to go back by ship to Havana and then by rail to Santiago. And that's when he decided that he was not going to practice medicine in the fields of Orient. The experience was just too frightening for him. And he opened up an office in Santiago. That's when he met my mother-to-be. My mother-to-be is something else. That could be a book by itself.
Let's move along to a little further. So the racial wars played a big part, certainly, and General Menocal became President Menocal, and then President Zayas as well. Both of them were key actors when you start getting into...
Zayas is the founder of the Liberal Party of Cuba. Menocal is really it was not the only founder, but he was of a conservative party. There were two party systems, but it is the liberals are built up because there is a huge backlash against the conservative party that suppressed the three racial wars, and the liberal thought was introduced in Cuba by Zayas, who was he never fought in any of the War of Independence. He was really the first civilian, brilliant man, a poet, essays. He was an aristocrat with a don and an E. Zayas Bazán, E. Fonseca or something. So he got rid of the E and the don, and he became a populist politician. He was elected by a majority, And his government, unfortunately, was horrible. The national debt increased. There were sinecures. There was so much patronage that it was big government, patronage, sinecures, and corrupt. In that Liberal Party was a young veteran of the War of Independence called Gerardo Machado y Morales. He was a liberal, and he defended the black insurrection in Las Villas. Machado's rise, Merocado almost hangs him, but there is an immediate amnesty, and he's released. He resigns from the army and becomes a businessman, a very good businessman in Santa Clara. He realized that he was very popular in Santa Clara and Las Villas because of his action in Afro-Cubans saw in him a champion for their cause. And he realized all of a sudden that he had a political future. And he became a minister of the Interior with, I forget the president, but he was a liberal president before Sayas. And he was a general in the War of Independence. Juan Alberto Gomez came back in my memory. He became a Secretary of the Interior. And I gave him a chance to travel all over Cuba. He became very, very popular. And he became a pain in the neck for Sayas because he did not want the communists entering Cuba to form a party. They formed the Partido Popular at that time. He criticized the communists, and he was a very good Interior Secretary. So he decided to run for president with the Liberal Party, and he was successful. So successful, in fact, he received more votes, popular votes, than any president of Cuba. So in 1925, he promised reforms. He promised a honest government, and he went to the other side of the aisle and interviewed all of the conservatives. And he even named some conservatives to his cabinet. And with the promise that he was going to supervise them very closely. And he got the cooperation of the conservatives. And he did the same with his own party. And of course, they supported him. Those 4 first years of Machado were incredible, because that's the birth of modernity of Cuba. It was just incredible. The Havana expanded to the west. Nicolas Quintana described this very well. Havana grew in international stature. It became the darling city of the Americans. If you were anyone, or any celebrity in any country, you went to Havana, you had your photographs taken, and it was an incredible growth period. He his Achilles heel, and yet his most prominent achievements that come to my mind, one is modernizes the University of Havana and makes it the National University of Cuba. I converted an old Spanish fort, wooden fort, destroyed that, and built all the escalinata that you see today in Havana University. That improves the library. He really does an incredible job in that regard. The second thing most important, or really the first thing most important for Cuba and Machado was he builds the Central Highway, an incredible highway that goes from Pinar del Rio all the way to Oriente Province. It was a huge project, and a costly project. And what worried him was that he was not going to be able to finish it because he was going to run out of time. Presidents in Cuba at that time, they could only serve 4 years. And so he petitioned an elongation in the second term, 2 years. He was passed Congress, passed the Senate. It was taken to the Supreme Court, which approved it, and he was very happy with the result. He did not understand why the Cuban people turned against him, because they saw the opportunity for another 4 years of General Machado, and they saw tyranny. And a lot of good people turned against him. It was also Machado's fall was also created with what was happening in the world over. I mean, the communists in Russia were killing and executing their own party leaders. Germany had a horrible Weimar Republic that was failing, and the brown shirts were rising. And in Spain, the anarchist party was the largest political party in Spain, and that eventually created a civil war. The Irish were rising with Michael Collins against the Brits. France had a socialist government. Mexico had gone left also. And so Machado did not understand these movements. As a matter of fact, it's hard to understand these movements. They are like a hurricane. They have their own energy, and you cannot control the furies and the vortex of these political movements. And in the second term of Machado's government was very hard to understand. The crisis came when the violence in Cuba, created by underground revolutionary groups, they assassinated his sponsor. He was the Senate leader that controlled the Senate in Bello. He was assassinated in front of his house, and he was the man that organized his party to get him elected. His repression was brutal, and that antagonized the population. and he lost a lot of prestige because of it. And his supporters were dropping out at a speed that was difficult to comprehend. And new political groups were organized that had to go underground so they would not be prosecuted, including the ABC and La Joven Cuba, which are the two most important in Cuban history. So what happens? Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal decide to intervene in Cuba, and they send Sumner Wells, a special envoy, with the powers to deal with Machado directly. And what happened then was that Sumner Wells meets with the underground leaders of the ABC and other oppositionists, and he decides that Machado has to go, because if he stays, it's just going to be more bloodshed. And so the president's envoy, special envoy, deposes Machado, deposes President Machado, and he flies to Santo Domingo and then here in Miami, where he's buried here.
So from there, it's the rise of Batista, which is a whole other story. So
Because the populace is totally in disarray. General Batista, well, he's a Sergeant Batista, organizes a revolt that is successful. And the Sergeant's Revolt, September 4, 1933. And he corrals the constitutional officers in a hotel in Havana, and there's a firefight and a lot of casualties, and the non-commissioned officers win the day. It was a very popular revolt. But Batista then becomes a colonel, and he grows in stature because Sumner Wells really supports him. Sumner Wells sees in him order. He runs the armed forces. The armed forces bring order to the populace. It was a very dark period. In less than 6 years, in less than 7 years, there are 6 presidents of Cuba. You couldn't tell them apart. It was personalities, and there were no real.
okay, yeah. We're running out of time.
Yeah.
So maybe the thing to do, we have a lot to, there's a lot more to cover, but maybe we open to the audience if they have any questions.
That's
because if we go further, it's going to take more time here. So
Right.
if you want to go to the,
Yeah.
please.
Where can we get the book?
It's going to be in Amazon, and it's going to be in Books and Books, and it's going to be in what's the other library here for you? What? Barnes and Noble, correct.
So it'll be in Books and Books here in Miami.
In Miami,
And
Barnes and Noble. Yeah.
you can always get it in Amazon.
And Amazon. It's being printed now.
No, it's being printed now.
Is that thing working now? Or it's not?
No, it's not working. That's their machine, and it's not connecting to this machine to projector. So,
Oh, that's
but the
too
book
bad.
has a lot of the illustration. All the illustrations we have are in the book. So apologies to not having it here, because they're
Oh,
good
so
props
sorry
to see.
Because the photos are worth
Sure.
1,000 words. That's really too bad.
Any other questions? There's
Yeah.
You mentioned the other side of the family, and I didn't understand the word, the last name of the family. You mentioned something about the other side of the family.
The other side of the families are the BUCH,
Oh, the
the BUCH, which is Catalonia received a lot of immigrants from South France because of religious persecutions, and they migrated to Catalonia. That's why in Catalonia you find a lot of Germanic names. BUCH is a German name, and it means book. And Pepin Bosch is another Germanic name. There are a lot of Germanic names in Catalonia, particularly in the province of Gerona. And that's where we were able to trace it to. There was a little town in Bavaria, and the name of the town is Maria Buch. That's my grandmother, Maria Buch. It was kind of interesting when we came to that. So, yes, sir.
It is fascinating that you can go back, to the 16th century. How, I mean, did you have the benefit of all of the family members transferring all these?
Absolutely, absolutely. The family collected a lot of heirlooms, and the Cuban historians traced the Céspedes to Sevilla, and from there I was able to trace it to Osuna. I tried to visit these places, and I was able to go and visit these places. And it was just a fascinating journey. The original place is described in history, Cuban history books, as un lugar de céspedes. I found un lugar de céspedes. It's in northern Burgos. I visited with my wife. It was really an incredible journey. And from there, lugar de céspedes, the little town is 27 inhabitants. They're all payeses, peasants, Spanish peasants, with wooden clogs. They heat their homes with animals on the first floor. And, I was brought up thinking, well, these aristocrats. Well, they came from this place, and to get there, to escape that inhospitable place, which, by the way, is beautiful, but very cold, in the mountains of northern Burgos. And I said, where the hell could they go? And I looked at my Michelin map, and 4 kilometers west of where I was a Count de Frias township. And I figured, well, these payeses, which were enterprising, must have been recruited by Count Frias, who was fighting the Moors, and I think that's what happened. And he said, if that's true, I should find the house of the Céspedes and Count Frias. And Carol and I went there, and we found it. Because I had drawings of the Céspedes crest. The crest that the Hidalgos use and their banners and their chests. And there was the ruins of this beautiful place. But the crest, I could make it out in the entrance of the gate. So that night, I deduced that the way to get out of their situation was to fight for Count Frias. And they must have been good, excellent warriors, because then they were knighted. And then they fought. Northern Burgos, let's face it, it's a site where El Cid fought against the Moors. So the place is in battle of the Reconquista. And from there, they must have been very good warriors. And that's a very important point because these colonizadores, españoles, were warriors and veterans of the Reconquista. These were not very gentle people. They had been bloodied in battle. They killed a lot of Moors. They kicked them out of Seville. They conquered Andalusia. A tremendous cost for the Moors and themselves. Horrible wars. And I think all of a sudden peace came, and they didn't know what to do with themselves.
Well, there could be arguments about who came first. You know, I don't want to get into that.
Yeah, it's
So,
right.
you know, we talk about Reconquista, but then again, if you, historical basis, you know, Spain wasn't there when the Moors came in. They were the Gauls.
Yeah, right. You know.
So Spain didn't exist. So, you know, they're claiming it back now.
Yeah, I could not identify that far. I cannot identify that far.
But
Because I think un lugar de eso is this race of human beings in that place comes from the original Europeans, like the Basque people do, or the Scots and the Vikings. You know, they're original people. They're not contaminated with anything. But they had to been very excellent warriors to fight.
That's why history is so fascinating.
Yes, it is. Any more questions? Yes, sir.
You know, I came here to listen to you because I think you have a sense of how the ideas that originated the war of independence and so forth and the problems are still shaping our present history and our present problems. I want to hear what you have to say.
Well, I think the war of independence is not finished. I see the communist regime, we're going to overthrow the communist regime. It's just not compatible with our history or our ideals. It just isn't. It doesn't work. And how is this going to happen? I graduated from Harvard College when Stalin died in 1953. And I remember sitting with the faculty, some members of the faculty, and watching the television at Dumont about this size, to see the Soviet Union collapse. It did not happen. It was to be almost 30 years later, in 1982, that the wall came down and then Russia and the Soviet Union collapsed. I think this is Cuba's communist demise is going to happen exactly like it happened with the Soviet Union. Each generation is going to become more cognizant of the horrible government. They're going to start conspiring exactly as it happened in Russia. You pay a price. But you remember when the Soviet Union collapsed? This huge army was going against the populace in Moscow. And everybody thought, oh, they're going to kill thousands and thousands of people. It never happened. Never happened. I think the same is going to happen with Cuba. I'm 86, so I don't think I'm going to be there 30 years from now. but I'm hopeful. I think human nature, how can you not be free? I mean, it's just an impossible system.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much to both of you. And I really have apologized for the technical failure. I know that the pictures that he has are excellent, and they're very important complement to the history that he's trying to describe. So I really feel bad about it. But thank you so much for coming.